Live. Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I am a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very, very many reasons. What this is just an open conversation. It's just, I'm here. Maybe someday I'll play video games while I chat with you all, and it'll be a much more common version of how live streaming works. But until and unless that day comes, this is just a slightly different version of live streaming. I'm here. I'll be talking about whatever we're talking about. What game would I play? Well, that's a good question, actually. At this point in my life, I would probably switch games. There was a point in my life where I did specialize. For about 4 years, I played League of Legends fairly intensively. But these days, I tend to play like single player story-driven games that, play it and then move on to the next one. Until that day comes, I'm just sitting here talking to you all. And I'm talking about whatever unless somebody is asking things or saying things in the chat. I'll be just doing my best to say stuff that I think might be of interest to you all, who I'm just imagining who you might be. The more that you all participate in chat, we already have one comment in there, which I appreciate, the more information I have about who you are and what you might be interested in. And that's great. And I love that. So don't worry about keeping things on topic. If I'm talking about something, whether on my own or interacting with somebody in the chat, feel free to say whatever you want to say, regardless of whether it seems to you like that is on topic or some other direction. I work at a therapy practice where our offices are located in Northbrook, Illinois, called Effective Artistry. We do individual, couples, and family therapy with people who are located in the state of Illinois. We are, I'm excited to state, we will finally be launching some group therapy opportunities very soon. Something we've been wanting to do and exploring for quite some time, and the timeline is more defined now. So we'll keep you updated on that. But we also work with a couple executive functioning coaches who can work with people anywhere in the world. But for therapy, we work with people in the state of Illinois in the United States. I think that's mostly it, basically it. I guess I'll say, if you do participate in the chat, which I love, that those comments will be posted. This is saved as a video on demand afterwards, right? You can go and watch this on YouTube or on Facebook or wherever. And the comments are saved with that. And the comments are associated with whatever account that you are logged into. So if you're commenting from your Facebook account, then those comments will be associated with your Facebook account. One of the very many reasons that this isn't therapy is that it is a public conversation on the internet that anyone can access. So keep that in mind. But yeah, otherwise, I think that's about everything. Let's talk games. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed with open world games because there's so many options, but also I hate games that make you just complete task after task too simple. Yeah, okay, let's talk games. I like that. And I feel similarly, certainly. Like, there are some games where, all right, let's talk games. Both video games, but also just generally games. I play a lot of board games. I'm big into game design and that kind of thing. What kind of games people play tells you a lot. So just something to start off with at the top is, I'll talk to people, parents especially, obviously, who will say things like, oh, my kid just loves to play video games. And I'll say, oh, what games? And they're like, I don't know, just video games, right? As though that's all one thing, like all video games are the same. And they are very much not. In the same way that, like, we wouldn't just say, oh, so-and-so loves to read, or I love to read, or so-and-so loves music. It's not all music, right? Like, each of us have our focuses. Even when somebody is saying something like, oh, I like all different kinds of music, they still have their kinds that they are listening to the most, like their artists that they like the best and their styles and genres that they go to the most frequently. And having that kind of information helps you understand a lot about a person. So I'll say that right off the top, that, yeah, focusing in on like what kinds of games people like, whether board games, video games, role-playing games, whatever, can give you a lot of information about that person. Makes me think of people really being into Animal Crossing during the pandemic. Yeah, very, very beginning of the pandemic, in like February, March, April 2020, Animal Crossing was big. Let me focus in on video games for now, because it seems like that's where we're mostly talking. There are reasons that people like video games. First of all, not everybody likes them, right? And we can talk about that, why some people might like them and some people might not. But they're very popular. If that's the case, if anything is ever very popular, there must theoretically be reasons that they're popular, right? That there's this thing that happens, especially with kids, where if children are enjoying something, we automatically assume and act as though whatever the thing is bad. That we're very focused on getting kids to do things that they don't enjoy. A lot of this has to do with thoughts about delayed gratification and the marshmallow test and all this stuff, which is very flawed. But people are walking around asking questions legitimately and very frequently, like, why do kids love video games? What is going on here? As though it's in some way different than if we were to say, why do people like movies, or why do people like books? It's a medium, right? Like, it is a method of conveying information in the same way that a book or a movie or a song is. There's nothing that unites video games as any more of a monolith than if we were to say that all movies are the same. And we can all understand and acknowledge, in large part because pretty much universally in our culture, we have experiences of seeing movies and listening to songs and reading books, where video games is not that. There are many people in this culture who have not played video games, or haven't played it very much, or haven't played it since they were a child, and things like that. So we're observing this and analyzing it completely differently, as though it needs some other kind of explanation for why people would enjoy it than whatever explanation we could get for why people enjoy movies or books or songs. And the first thing that many people are going to say in response to what I'm saying is, yeah, but video games aren't art, which is I was about to sarcastically say something, so I'll instead be more clear, which is a very tedious debate to me that people have been engaging in for decades at this point. Is video game art? Which, my first question whenever I'm talking about something like that with someone is, well, what makes something art? Because if they define what they mean by art, then we can quantitatively determine, or maybe not quantitatively, but fairly confidently and somewhat objectively determine, does video games meet that criteria? But if we leave art ill-defined as just like something that I think is emotional or powerful or whatever, well, then we're really just talking about whether you think video games are emotional or powerful. Here's what we can say about video games. They allow a person to receive auditory, visual, and tactile input data, right? Movies give you visual and auditory data. Books give you visual data. And all of these things, books, all of these things, we take we take that data, and then we translate it, we interpret it the same way we do with all like communication, right? So at the end of the day, this is all conceptual. What we're talking about is what do I have access to as the person who's creating this thing that you are going to interact with? What can I use in order to evoke concepts in your mind? With a book, all I can use is the written language, unless I'm using illustrations, in which case I can use illustrations, but it's all visual data. With a movie, we get the visuals and the auditory data. With a video game, we get visual, auditory, and tactile data. So just looking at it through that lens, with music, we just get the auditory data, right? Just looking at it through that lens, you can see it all of a sudden why video games might be very popular for people, because call it art or whatever. I'm going to call it art for the purpose. No, I'm not, because that's going to let people dismiss this, that I don't want people to be able to dismiss this point. I kind of see video games as art you can interact with. You as the player can impact your own experience with the art, which is really cool. I very much agree. Now, this is not universal to all video games per se. Many video games the player doesn't have much of an ability to impact how it goes. Maybe I shouldn't say many, some. Mostly we do. And that's something I was going to get to in a little bit of one of the reasons that video games are so popular. But I'll just go to it now. What we're looking for, generally, humans, what we are looking for as an enjoyable cognitive experience, well, an enjoyable experience generally, but especially so when we're talking about utilizing cognition, thoughts, right, are really tight feedback loops. We want to get information about a problem, utilize that information in order to rearrange, come up with, retrieve more things from working memory, retrieve more things from long-term memory, come up with ideas, and then be able to execute those ideas, put them into action, and then observe what happens, which is more data, right? I call this, for ease of reference for myself, I call this acquisition, arrangement, application, that we're acquiring data, then we arrange and rearrange that data into new configurations until we come up with something that feels useful or seems useful to us to apply. And then we apply that idea. And in applying that idea, we're interacting with the real world, which gives us more information. So we acquire more information. And we want very tight loops on that. I think pretty much everybody, but I'm guessing especially people who are here, can understand or can relate to the idea that having very loose feedback loops is fairly miserable. Getting information about a problem and then having lots and lots and lots of time to be able to think about the problem, to try and come up with ideas about what could be done about the problem before having an opportunity to do anything about the problem and therefore get more information, is miserable. This experience of thinking about something without being able to actually try it and get more information is miserable. The longer it goes, the worse. So yes, one of the things about video games is that it is very tight feedback loops. You are at all times, with a well-designed game, you are at all times getting information relevant to problems. Now, are they problems that are relevant to your real life? Hopefully not, typically not. As is generally true with film, books, music, all other forms of art, right? We call that stuff cathartic. And when we're talking about it in movies or whatever, we find all kinds of value in cathartic experiences where you feel some kind of way about something which isn't actually happening in your real life. Of course, that happens in video games too. Again, one of the things that people will point to as like they're attempting to dismiss or denigrate video games is like, oh, people take it so seriously, or they get so involved, or they care so much. But nobody ever says that about a movie of like, oh, I can't believe people felt so strongly about that character's death. What a terrible thing that people would engage with a movie like that. No, we use that as an example of a movie that's really, or not an example. We use that we view that as a characteristic of a movie that is good. If a movie makes you feel things. Catharsis is the idea that we can feel things about something which isn't actually causing any real impact in our life other than the way that it's making us think and feel. It's beneficial, right? Like to be able to have the opportunity to feel fear about something that isn't actually dangerous, or feel anger about something that didn't actually harm you. I love the ways games communicate to players without the dialogue, through light, through sounds, etc. Yeah, there are some games I could very much recommend to you if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in. So video games, that's all we're really talking about is auditory, visual, and tactile feedback. Tactile because you are using some kind of input, but also, especially these days with console gaming, there's a lot of haptic feedback, meaning, the controller will vibrate or shake or whatever when certain things happen in the game. And that generally speaking, we're talking about something with some form of interactivity. Now, again, people will generally only think of something as art if it has a comprehensible narrative, which many video games do not. There's not a storyline to Tetris, for example. People would debate whether a comprehensible narrative is necessary for something to be considered art, especially in the realm of visual art. Sometimes people make a particular point of presenting art that does not have an obvious or at all in any way reasonable, comprehensible narrative as a part of creating the artistic experience of being presented with something that doesn't have a comprehensible narrative. Anyway, generally speaking, yes, video games provide a very tight problem solving feedback loop. You're presented with information about a problem, you're able to come up with an idea of what to do about it, implement and attempt that idea with no threat of actual danger to yourself, which makes it different from real life problem solving, where if I'm trying to figure out how to like communicate with this person that because I want to be friends with them, there are actual stakes involved with that, right? If I fail at that, what that would mean is that I tried talking to them and we didn't become friends, and that could have ramifications for me. There are even, although many times very outlandish outlier possibilities, but there are even possibilities for actual real like harm to happen, right? If I say the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time, I could be physically or otherwise harmed. So video games are cathartic. They allow you to explore and experiment and attempt to solve problems over and over and over without real life consequences. When video games are well designed, they are scaffolding that process very well, meaning that each new problem is a challenge. Part of what you were talking about earlier when you say, I hate games that just make you complete task after task too simple. Well, I am interpreting what you're saying to be they make you complete the same task over and over and over, because all video games and life itself could be described as something that you're just completing one task after the other. If it's too simple, it seems to me that you're probably referring to something where you're doing the same thing over and over. So a very common complaint about certain kinds of video games these days would be that it's just a fetch quest over and over, right? Where you see somebody and they're like, hey, I need this thing. And then you have to go get that thing and bring it back to them. And then you find somebody else and they say, I need this thing. And you got to go get that thing and bring it back to them over and over. In the same way that like real life stuff can get repetitive, and if it's simplistic, right? Like that I'm just shoveling some dirt into this pile. I shovel, I shovel, I shovel, I shovel. Now we can get into, and this is true of the video games also, with tasks like that, humans can get into a state that many people would refer to as meditative, where because what you're engaged in no longer takes cognitive resources, but does still take your, you still have to continue to do things with your body in order to make it happen. It can free your mind up to explore other things and enter other states and whatever, because your body is occupied and in a sense trapped, right? You can't go do any other thing, but you can think about other things. I don't know if this is still true, but I did when I was in grad school, I did a project on video games, studying video games. And this was 10-ish years ago, about 10 years ago. At the time, the statistics were that the average gamer in the United States is 35 years old and female, meaning more women played video games than men. And that if you averaged all the ages of all the people playing video games, it comes out to 35. Both of those things are surprising to people because we think of video games in our culture as being more of a quote unquote boy thing and more of a thing that younger people do. Part of the reason we think about it that way is because we are constraining what video games we're counting. But phone games are video games, right? And especially about 10 years ago, this was like the height of Angry Birds popularity and stuff. Phone games were a big thing. They still are a very, very big thing. Social games were and are still a very big thing, not in exactly the same like crude way that early implementations were, you know, Farmville or whatever on Facebook, but there are still lots of that going on. Why did I start saying that? Oh, because I was pointing out that a lot of phone games, which are a lot of the most popular games in terms of how much like time is dedicated to playing it, you know, how many person hours is spent playing a game. A lot of those are very simplistic, very repetitive, in the same way that like people doing Sudoku over and over and over, which is a common thing. I've had a few months of enjoying playing Sudoku, and I played it on my phone, which makes it a video game. So sometimes doing the same task over and over with just slight variations can actually be quite enjoyable. It can be exactly what someone's looking for. It depends on what they're looking for, which takes us back to knowing what kinds of games people are playing with and the patterns of how they're engaging with those games tells you a lot about a person. There is a big difference. Even if you're looking at two different people who both spend the exact same amount of time and energy playing games, There's a big difference between a person who's spending that amount of time playing Minecraft versus someone who's spending that amount of time playing, I don't know, League of Legends. uh, the different kinds of games, they give you different kinds of experiences. It's kind of like if you look at both of those people and say, oh, they're just big into video games, it would be like talking about somebody who loves watching all these horror films and somebody else who loves watching like art house foreign films from the 70s and saying they both love the same thing because they both love watching movies. What kind of games am I into? What does that say about you? It's a good question. These days, I am mostly playing open world games because, let me clarify. I like this question. What does it say about you? Because I've been using that phrase and I was kind of expecting or hoping to get to this. Because a lot of the time people think what I mean by that is like it tells you a lot about a person's characteristics or like who they are or what their deep-seated unmet needs are or whatever. And I think it is true that you can describe some of this in that way, but I think that language is, I'm intentionally choosing kind of an elevated language there. The fact that these days am playing mostly open world games, one of the reasons that that's what I'm doing is because the pattern of my life as somebody who runs a business and has 3 young children, whatever, is that when I get to play video games, it's for a relatively short period of time, right? Anywhere from 10 minutes to 30 minutes at a time. And that it's not infrequent that I will go weeks without being able to play a video game. So while there are other kinds of games that I preferred in a different point of my life, these days, playing a game with like a very intense storyline, for example, something I used to love, is not nearly as enjoyable for me because if I ever have to take a break, like if we're traveling or whatever, and I just can't play the game for a couple weeks, then by the time I come back to it, it's like, wait, what was going on? Like those games worked for me better when I was able to kind of play a lot more in a sitting and play, have the ability to sit down and play a sitting of the game much more frequently and consistently. So right now I'm playing a game called Star Wars Outlaws, which just came out. And it's an open world game. So what that allows me to do is like, I have a bunch of different things that can be done, both in terms of like, and if there's time and if I forget to, I would ask that somebody remind me to come back and talk about the executive functioning element of gaming and how that plays into all this. But, I have a big quest tracker with all these different things that at any point I can just look up, like what's something I can go do. But also I could just kind of, the world is constructed in such a way that if I just move in a certain direction for some amount of time, I have a reasonable expectation that I will come across something where it's a quick, like, I can spend 5 to 10 minutes accomplishing some task and then put it away and come back. And the narrative is, by the nature of how an open world game, I guess I should explain just in case, is to some extent what it sounds like. The player is placed into a world where you can travel around the world at your own discretion, right? As opposed to a linear game where you have to go from place A to place B to place C, whatever. When people talk about like levels in video games, which is one of the things that, in case this matters to you, if you mention the word levels in talking about video games, just know that everybody's going to think you don't know anything about video games, because that's a term that really hasn't been relevant for most games in like 30 years. It's the equivalent of calling, if somebody's playing Xbox saying that they're playing Nintendo, it's like, oh, okay, you're telling on yourself as somebody who doesn't really know much about, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, just so that you know. But yeah, linear games, you have to go through a particular prescribed, like the game is designed so that you do A, then B, then C, then D, and so on. An open world game is, here's this kind of playground and we've scattered a bunch of stuff all over the place and set it up so that for the most part, you can kind of go wherever you want, whenever you want. They will build constraints into that. I don't know how much it matters, but it's fun to me to give like language stuff. Sometimes that's through what's referred to as a Metroidvania game, which is like some spots in that world can only be accessed once you've unlocked a certain ability or acquired a certain piece of equipment. So that's kind of a way to make sure there are opportunities for you to do things that you couldn't do earlier in the game that you can do later in the game. Sometimes it's just by having a world that doesn't scale, meaning, if you go over here, there's these monsters or whatever that have this amount of hit points and do this much damage, and like they're just going to wreck you unless you have leveled up a lot before you can get over there. But by the nature of those games, because they cannot predict where, the whole point is that you can't predict where the player is going to be going and in what order, the narrative is much more fragmented. It's built for you to be able to go wherever and do whatever in whatever order and still work out. So that's why I'm playing mostly those kinds of games recently. Is it's fun to be able to get in, have a narrative that I'm able to explore, but in a way that I can do small chunks for a brief period of time. When I was younger and had the opportunity to play games much more than I currently do, my favorite kinds of games were always like fairly intense single player RPG games. The Mass Effect series was one of my favorites. All the BioWare games back in the day. Again, I don't know which things are worth explaining or not. Board games wise, I primarily play board games in the format of video games these days. There's a website, I'll just plug it, boardgamesarena.com, that lets you play. Like, they have a massive library of board games that you can then play with people that you're not physically with, because my family loves to play board games and I like to play board games with them. My family meaning my parents and siblings and extended family. And I don't live near any of them, so it's a fun way for us to be able to kind of keep in contact. And we play these games in a turn-based way, so that when it's my turn, I can log in and take my turn, and then they take their turn. And hours or days can go in between turns, so it's a nice way to stay connected. And they're like, the board games I play are really just dictated by what people are choosing to play. I have certain mechanics that I like. I like engine building games. I like drafting mechanics. I could get into a lot of like esoteric language and details about games. What does that say about me? So that's a large part of what it says about me, right? Right there. It tells you a lot about the pattern in which I am engaging in games, the priority that games have in my life, the role that they play in my life, right? Which is definitely something I refer to more as, well, I don't want to introduce that language because that's a whole nother conversation. They're low down on the priority list, right? That like, I have many, many other things in my life that take my resources that are much more important to me than playing video games. But I do enjoy playing video games. And I think maybe what you're getting at is like, what is it about the experience of playing a video game that makes it so that it's enjoyable for me, or that it's on my priority list at all? I'm happy to talk about that some. Well, I guess I can just talk about that. For me, the nature of my work and my life is that everything is very, very cognitively oriented. I'm a therapist. My job, I sit and I talk to people all day. And that sometimes people phrase being a therapist in that way in order to kind of dismiss the effort that it must take. Like, all you do is sit around and talk to people in a very comfortable office. And it's true if you describe it that way, which is very similar to saying, like, to a programmer, all you do is sit in front of a computer and press buttons all day, right? Like, the difficulty involved in the job is primarily cognitive. It's about, and I just censored myself from a bunch of things there. That's interesting. So I'm thinking all day long. And part of what I'm always trying to talk to people about is that thinking is not free. Thinking doesn't, like, cognition utilizes body systems in the same way that motion does. It utilizes resources similar to how motion does. Different systems, different resources, but it's not free. It costs something to think. And so managing my cognitive resources, to me, is just as much a part of my job, or at least part of what enables me to do my job as well as I am able to do it, just as much as like managing an athlete's body is to them, right? That for an athlete, let's say a professional football player, just because that's the one sport that I pay any attention to. Their job is to play the game, right? Their job is to, whatever their particular role is on the football field on Sunday, that's what their job is. But in order to do that job well, they have to be doing a lot of working out, right? They also have to spend a lot of time learning plays and studying film and running drills and building relationships and the ability to communicate with their teammates. There are all these things that they need to do in order to be able to perform their actual job at the highest level that they're able to do. So for me, managing my cognition is like that if I show up to work one day, and as everybody has the experience, we all have the experience of having a day where it's like, you know what, I just can't really think very much right now. Or if it's not a day, you get to the end of your day and nighttime and it's like, I can't even make a decision about what to eat for dinner, right? We do have our ability to think efficiently, increases and decreases based on different factors. And if I show up to work one day and am in a place where thinking is not working very well for me, it's similar to if a football player shows up for a game one day and they're injured, or, they just don't have the energy in them to be able to run very fast. It impacts my ability to do what I'm trying to do. So a large part of why I play video games the way that I do at this point in my life is in order to manage my cognition. Now, that it wouldn't be able to do for me what it does for me if it wasn't something that I enjoy. I'm interested in. What do you do when your mental energy is drained during a session? That's a very good question. Oh, I missed a comment too. Clearly, I'm interested in them, but I tend to get in my head about the things you've mentioned: resources, what other things about playing the games, judgment, etc. Oh, that's a good question. Both of these are good questions, and they're actually related. So let's talk about this. This is really very important, I think, to understand. I talk with almost every client I ever worked with at some point about this. What I'm talking about here, that thinking is not free. We can talk about like the physically observable processes of cognition, that the way that glucose is utilized, that dopamine is a catalyst that triggers cells to start processing glucose in order to extract electrical energy from the chemical, translating the chemical energy, the chemical potential energy in glucose into electrical energy and producing the byproduct, the waste byproduct of glutamate, which then needs to be cleared out and blah, blah, blah. We can talk about how there have been studies done on competitive chess players and that they burn 6,000 calories or so in a day of competitive chess, like at a tournament over the course of a day. But we can also just reference each individual person's experience, that everybody knows when you have an experience where you're thinking very deeply and intensely for a long period of time, like the more you're doing it, the more difficult it becomes to continue doing it. If you've taken the SAT or the ACT, think about what that experience was like and about what thinking was like afterwards. Whenever you have a very difficult or intense conversation with somebody, think about how that feels and how it feels afterwards. Literally, it dehydrates you, et cetera, et cetera. So what do I do when my mental energy is drained during a session? Well, energy is a fun thing and very worth talking about, especially in terms of executive functioning, but also just kind of across the board. We have to start with energy is not something that we can really objectively define in what we're talking about, right? Like in physics, there's all kinds of definitions of what energy is. But as humans, we're talking about like energy that we feel, energy levels, like I feel energized in this way or drained in this way. It's not really something we can define categorically or objectively. We can say fairly confidently that there are at least two different things, likely much more, that we're referring to when we talk about energy, because we all have experiences where we do something and then after we do that thing, we're more energized in one way, but drained in another way. Like many people have the experience of working out and feeling energized by that. Physically speaking, your body is drained by it, and you know that, you feel that drain, you can even feel sore and whatever. And sometimes that just makes it that much more energizing in a different way. So talking about energy management is very useful, but it's individualized, or I think it is best to approach it through an individual lens, that each person needs to divide this up for themselves in whatever categories there's, call it physical energy and mental energy and social energy or whatever, creative energy, whatever works for you. And then it's good to start tracking that. Now, energy is a resource. Whatever we're talking about, it's a resource. It's something that you can expend as you engage in certain tasks. And it's also, like every other resource, something that can be replenished by other tasks. So all sessions are going to drain my energy. And I know that's not what you're asking. And I promise I'll get in a minute to what I think you are actually asking. But all sessions drain my energy, my cognitive energy, my ability to speak and listen and think, right? So what I'm trying to do is set myself up so that I am able to get through whatever day of sessions I have and be able to have the resources necessary to expend there. I think what you're asking when you say, what do you do when your mental energy is drained during a session is, what do you do if you get to the point where your mental energy is so low that you really don't have it in you to be able to continue to think about things in the way you usually do. Now, in real terms, in nuanced terms, it's the same as what everybody does, meaning that theoretically, every moment you're doing it, your ability to continue to do it efficiently diminishes, right? And so any threshold we put on that of like, oh, I'm drained now is an arbitrary one. There's not actually going to be, there would theoretically be a point at which, no, I literally cannot think anymore and would fall asleep or whatever. But that's not realistic in terms of what's happening. What's happening is just my ability to think efficiently goes up and down. That some of my answers to this takes us in a different direction that I don't know that it's worth going into about what therapy is, because there are different elements of what we're doing in therapy that are useful. And not all of it is about, it all involves cognition, but different types of cognition, if that makes sense. I'll say that there have been times, especially earlier in my career, before I got my life structured in the way that I need it to be structured in order to be able to do what I do. There were times earlier in my career where I would get very sleepy, kind of the trying to stay awake thing that people experience in school or when driving sometimes or whatever. And I'd like to think I did it right away, but I'm sure that I did not. But at some point early on realized or came to the conclusion, or somebody helped me to realize that when that happens, I just need to say out loud what's happening rather than try and hide it and feel shame about it and not let them know. To just say, you know what, I'm having a really hard time keeping my eyes open. For me, what that turned into, because that's not always the case. So I would say, I'm having a really hard time keeping my eyes open. And that doesn't usually happen to me in sessions. And certainly things can play into that are purely about me and nothing about you, about my body and what kind of sleep I'm getting and whatever. But again, it doesn't happen usually. So typically it means that there is also something going on here where I'm feeling bored or trapped or whatever. All these things, by the way, are very scary things for a therapist to say to a client. It's hard to train people to be willing to do this. So I guess I'm just wondering, do you feel like we're talking about something that feels important to you, or that you're just kind of going through the motions and talking about stuff that doesn't really matter and it becomes useful? But primarily, I am focused on structuring my life so that I have the resources necessary to get, to do the sessions, to do the work that I'm doing, as most people do, right? Theoretically, most people have structured their lives in such a way or are in the process of trying to figure out how to structure their lives in such a way that enables them to get through their day pleasantly and successfully and, do the things that they're trying to do to the best of their ability to do those things. Now, that other comment about I like video games, but I tend to get in my head about the things you mentioned, resources, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of the reasons that I end up talking about video games as much as I do with people, and it does come up fairly frequently. Energy is a resource, and like every other resource, certain things tax it, you have to expend it, and other things replenish it. Well, why would people be doing these things, right? In other words, we could theoretically break down everything everybody does into one of two categories. And it's possible that something could, and hopefully many things could be in both categories simultaneously in different ways. But either we're doing something productive or we're doing something unproductive is the way that people would generally view it. Well, here's something that is by definition unproductive. Sleep. Sleep is unproductive. You're not getting your work done while you're sleeping. And yet none of us have any issue with thinking about the fact that sleep is important, right? That even though you're not getting your work done or working on your art or like cleaning your house or whatever other things that we think are important, we still think sleep is important. Why? Because sleep is restful and restorative. If you don't sleep, you notice the implications, not the implications, you notice the effects of it very quickly. It reduces your ability to do pretty much everything. So we think of sleep as necessary. Well, sleep is not the only thing that is restorative to our resources, right? Eating food is also something that if you don't eat enough food or drink enough water or whatever, you will notice the detrimental effects very, very quickly. There are many things that are restorative, especially for different kinds of energy. But one like kind of shorthand way that I think is very useful for people is if you're enjoying something, that's a strong indication that it is something which is restoring resources to you. Because if we say, why do humans have the ability to feel pain? Why have we as a species evolved this mechanism which allows us to feel this very unpleasant thing to feel called pain? And everyone, for the most part, can answer that pretty easily of like, well, because it draws our attention to things that are problematic or harmful for us, things that if we weren't to notice them might kill us or damage us in some way that makes our ability to survive, less likely. And that's true, obviously. I mean, as far as we are able to tell using all the evidence that we have available, the reason that we're able to feel pain is because if something's causing you pain, that thing is something which will either kill you or make your death more likely, limit your ability to continue to survive if it is not addressed. So the pain calls your attention to that thing so that you can address it. And obviously, sometimes we're wrong about that, right? There are all kinds of things, everyone would agree, there are all kinds of things that we do that cause us to feel pain that we would agree are beneficial things to do, right? You get surgery on something that helps you to survive better, or hell, you work out, which causes you to feel soreness, which is pain, but it's because you believe that if you do that in the right way over the right period of time, it increases your ability to do better things later. We are very aware of this culturally, that many of the things that cause us pain are actually beneficial for us to do, right? Now, here's the second question that nobody ever thinks about this. Why do we have the ability to feel joy or pleasure? Why have humans evolved to have that mechanism? The obvious answer is, in the same way that pain draws our attention to things that might cause us problems, joy or pleasure draws our attention to things that might be beneficial to us, right? That certain kinds of food taste good because eating that kind of food is beneficial to us. Now, in the same way that we know that there are all kinds of things that cause pain that are actually good for us, it is also true that there are all kinds of things that are enjoyable or pleasurable that are actually bad for us. That's definitely true. And that people are very aware of, right? We're all aware of the fact that there is stuff that you like to do or is enjoyable to do, but you shouldn't do it because it's bad for you. But that's the exception, not the rule, right? In the same way that if you're doing something and you begin to feel pain, your immediate response should always be to stop doing that thing so that the pain stops. Now, sometimes when you do that, you'll say, oh, actually, this is something good for me to continue doing, and you'll keep going. Or sometimes you're prepared going in knowing that it's going to hurt. And so as the pain comes up, you keep going. But in order to override that default response to pain, you have to have some intellectual understanding, some belief, logical conclusion that doing this is actually beneficial to me, even though it feels painful. Joy should be the same way. That in order to override joy, meaning like this thing is something I really like doing, or I'm getting pleasure from this thing, in order to then say, but I shouldn't do it, there should be some intellectual understanding, some logical chain of thoughts that lead you to, even though evidence would suggest that this is a beneficial thing to me, I've actually come to the conclusion that it's not. And so I should override that ability. If something is enjoyable or pleasurable, you should just lean into doing it until and unless you have some actual identifiable reason not to. This is a big part of the problem of a lot of stuff going on in our culture, but especially with kids, and a lot of it plays into video games. We can theorize, and I have theorized a lot and happy to share my theories. We can theorize about specifically what it is that would make video games enjoyable for a given individual. But the fact that they are enjoyable for a given person indicates that in some way that experience is beneficial to that person. Is it possible that that's not true? Absolutely. But if we're going to prove that, the burden of evidence is on that, right? That we have to be able to identify why it is bad. And here's what comes up over and over when we're talking, because mostly when we talk about video games or digital technology, generally, we're talking about kids, right? Most of the time, not all the time. And what keeps coming up over and over is this concept called opportunity cost, meaning every hour you spend playing a video game is an hour that you aren't spending doing X, Y, or Z other thing that would be beneficial to do. And that's true. Is also a true statement about literally anything. Anything. You spend an hour doing X, that's an hour you are not spending doing anything which is not X. So why does it only come up when we're talking about things like video games or other things that we identify as being nothing or lazy or distractions or so on? Because we already came to that conclusion that that was a bad thing to do before reaching for the opportunity cost justification. Meaning we, for whatever reason, just had some thought, some feeling that this is a bad thing that people shouldn't be doing. Now we need to be able to justify it. And we say, well, because it prevents you from doing these other things. And that's true. Again, one of my favorite articles on this subject was called "Video Games Are as Addictive as Gardening," because it is true of all things. Now, that's not to say that there are no differences, because there certainly are. For example, gardening has built-in limitations in your ability to engage with it, right? Eventually, you'll run out of stuff to do on the plot of land that you're working on. Eventually, your body will become too sore and tired to continue to engage in the work, even if it is enjoyable. Eventually, it will become dark, or there will be times where it's raining and there's just, you can't do those things. Where video games or digital technology stuff generally is stuff that is very convenient and accessible. You can play at any time of day, any weather conditions, and it doesn't take a lot of physical energy. Not none, which is worth coming back to if we have time, but not a lot. And so there are very little built-in constraints on your ability to engage with video games. And so it is true that people will play video games more than they would garden, not because they find it more enjoyable intrinsically, but because they have the opportunity and the ability to engage with it more so, right? One of the fun things about the way we use language in our culture is anytime somebody says something like, well, it stimulates the same part of the brain as heroin or whatever, generally what they're talking about is dopamine. And it's something that just dopamine gets released whenever you do anything which is enjoyable. So if there's anything somebody is doing that they're enjoying, whether that's playing with their grandchildren or playing a video game or eating something tasty or whatever, then dopamine is getting released. We're only going to use the language, oh, it stimulates that same part of the brain as whatever, or it's addictive, and it's much. Gambling stimulates the same part of the brain as illicit drugs, right? If it's a thing that we don't like and we're trying to get people not to do, disincentivize people from doing. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't reasons that we shouldn't like that thing, but the fact that it stimulates that part of the brain or releases dopamine is not a reason in and of itself. So, assume, to start with, that playing a video game or scrolling on YouTube or whatever, anything that is enjoyable, anything that you like doing, assume that it is beneficial to you in a similar way that sleep is beneficial to you. Now, different problems, because again, there are built-in constraints on how much you can sleep that don't apply with video games and other activities. Things which are beneficial to you are beneficial in the right amounts. I said we'd come back to this idea that some things which are pleasurable are actually detrimental to us. A good example of this is sugar. Sugar is something that our species evolved to respond to in a very pleasurable way, right? When we eat sugar, it stimulates certain taste buds and whatever. Sweetness is sweetness. We like it. It is delicious. It feels good, tastes good, however, it's desirable. Well, sugar, the way that it operates in the body, is a very powerful and quickly accessible source of energy. You can translate sugar into energy very quickly, and especially disproportionately when it comes to cognition. It is also something that, in the context in which our species evolved, was very rare, very difficult to find. We're talking about fruits and honey, and that's pretty much it. So because it is beneficial and because it is rare, it makes sense that over time we evolved to be more and more highly incentivized to get it. Now the context has changed, and our bodies don't change quickly enough to keep up with that kind of stuff. That's not how evolution works. So now we have more or less unlimited access to sugar, and it is not beneficial in unlimited amounts. So that's a large part of where we're talking about things which are pleasurable are actually bad for you. A lot of the time, what we're talking about is too much of those things is bad for you. Again, something that people kind of instinctually, generally, that we understand. And how exactly to determine what amount is good and what amount is bad, that's where things get tricky. Because we can say something, for example, like, well, the average adult sleeps 6 to 8 hours per night, which is a demonstrably true statement because average is a mathematical concept. We have observed X number of adults sleeping over Y number of nights in different kinds of conditions. And we take all those results and we run it through some statistical analysis, and the average is 6 to 8 hours. Now, that's a pretty big window, for one. But for two, even if theoretically we could say something as simple as adults need 8 hours of sleep, and which we can't, but let's say we can, well, do we think then that the amount of sleep that my body would most optimally benefit from is going to be exactly the same after a day where I have been hiking through the desert for 8 hours as it is on a day where I was hanging out in a comfortable climate-controlled area, relaxing for the majority of the day? Do we think that the amount of sleep I'm going to need in order to operate optimally is going to be the same after a night where I just got less and interrupted sleep? No, nobody would argue that. We all understand that if there's a night where you only get 2 hours of sleep, the next night you're probably going to want to sleep a lot more than you usually would. So these are just statistical, our best attempt to observe what people happen. Then they get interpreted as recommendations, right? What we're actually saying is, over a large context, large sample size, it averages out this way. What that suggests is that in some way, across contexts, that humans average out to do best at this point, right? Well, that same thing can be talked about in terms of what do people do right now. We're talking about video games, for example. If large numbers of people play video games in particular patterns and certain ways, we can observe that and draw the conclusion then that theoretically there is some benefit to people engaging in this activity to this average extent. Any other conclusion is kind of absurd. Again, not to say that there's nothing to pay attention to. Opportunity cost is a big deal. But I'll tell you the number of people, well, first of all, I have this experience myself, but I've also worked with many, many people, especially teens and young people, who have said to me that, like, as much as I enjoy playing video games, at the time in my life where I did have days where I was able to sit down and play video games for 5, 6, 8 hours straight, rarely 8, but there were plenty of days where I had the opportunity to play for 8 hours straight. I don't know that I ever really played for that long. Playing for 5 or 6 hours straight, which did happen, I don't know with what frequency. But by the end of that time, I would stop playing and I would have this feeling of like a little, it's hard to describe. It's not that I didn't enjoy what I was doing. I did. It's not regret. It's not like guilt, but it is just this kind of like blah feeling. That now what I would think of it as is being relatively depleted in the kind of energy, the cognitive energy that it takes to play that kind of game. In the same way that, like, after going on a long hike, which is something I used to do a lot when I was a kid, going backpacking trips where we'd hike for 10 hours in a day. At the end of that day, I enjoyed everything I was doing that day. I don't have regrets or anything like that, but also not this blah feeling, which is the low, like, mental energy, whatever, but this like, oh, like I'm ready to sit down and just stay sitting down for a long period of time kind of feeling. There are built-in constraints on this, just not as much as there are for other things that we're more used to. So yes, you want to pay some attention to making sure that it's not interfering with your ability to do other things. But the best way to do that is to look at structuring your life, focusing on what needs to be included, not excluded. Meaning, rather than saying, I'm only going to let myself do video games for X number of time, or I'm only going to let my kids play video games for an hour a day or whatever. What's much more beneficial is to say, well, what are all the important and beneficial things that I want to be doing or need to be doing, would benefit from doing whatever. And let me make sure I'm fitting all that stuff in. Same with my kids. What are all the things that I think are important or beneficial or whatever? And let's make sure all that stuff gets done. After that, once all those things have been completed in a given day, that's what we culturally generally refer to as free time. Free time is not something you need to worry about restricting. That's the whole point, right? If there's something else, if you're saying, well, now there's free time, but it's still important that they X, Y, or Z, right? And not, sure, it's free time, but still it would be important to that they read. Well, then that just means that reading should be moved into the, like, what's important to get done in a day. Or now it's my free time, but it would be beneficial for me if I were to, like, socialize. Well, then let's put socialize on that list of stuff we want to make sure to get done. Once we get to free time, it should be whatever you want it to be. And that might be different things at different times, right? One day it might be playing video games all day long. The next day it might just be taking a nap. The next day it might be reading, whatever it is. Because I got to get wrapping up. Because here's a fun thing. Many of us, if not most of us, have heard that recommendation of people should drink 8 glasses of 8 ounces of water a day, which is a recommendation, right? Many people, myself included, have gone through periods of our life where we're focused on, like, oh, I should be drinking more, I'm too dehydrated. Well, if we look at the source of where that information comes from, it's specious. At least one of the major studies was done by the company that sells Gatorade, because some people are incentivized to convince you that you should drink even when you're not thirsty. And again, even if that's a solid finding to say that on average adults benefit from 8 glasses of 8 ounces of water every day optimally, well, I'm 6'5" and I weigh 240 pounds. Is it reasonable to think that my body optimally would utilize the exact same amount of water as somebody else, another adult who is 5'1" and 110 pounds? Seems unlikely. Certainly, would we assume that my body would optimally benefit from the exact same amount of water as one of the days where I was backpacking through the Red Rock deserts for 10 hours for that day, compared to another day where I'm sitting inside on a rainy, humid day and not doing anything that's making me sweat? No, of course not. So then we got to say, that's a good general recommendation, but we should individualize it. Well, how do we individualize it? There's all kinds of factors, all kinds of things. Here's the good news. Each of us already has a process, a mechanism built into our bodies that takes as much of those factors into consideration as possible and produces a result of exactly how much we should be drinking every day. And we call that thirst. When you're thirsty, you should drink. When you're not thirsty, less so, right? Now, there are all kinds of glitches in these things, right? There are times where I'm so invested in what I'm doing that even though I'm thirsty, I'm not noticing that sense of thirst and I'm not being really prompted or incentivized to go get some water. That's something that we all experience. So we all know that there are times where we would benefit from drinking water that we didn't actually notice feeling thirsty. That doesn't mean that we don't have a mechanism or that our own thirst shouldn't be trusted as, like, the best indicator we have. Is it perfect? No, but it's the best indicator we have. If you're enjoying playing video games, you're enjoying it for a reason. If there's some reason that you shouldn't be doing that, then great. You have a reason and you know what to do, right? Like, oh, I have to take care of this thing that's due at 7 o'clock tonight and it's going to take me about an hour and it's 6 o'clock. well, that's a good reason to say, even though I'm enjoying playing video games or even though I'm enjoying doing something else, I should stop and focus on this other thing. Or I'm enjoying playing video games right now, but it's midnight and I got to be up at 7 o'clock tomorrow. And I know that if I don't get to bed kind of soon, blah, blah, blah. Right. Again, all the time, every single day, we have reason to not do something that would be enjoyable or pleasurable for us. It's just that you should be clear on what the reason is. And if you are clear on what the reason is, then the course of action is also clear. You do that other thing that would be better for you to do instead. If you don't have that, then just a vague sense of like, I shouldn't be doing this is not a very useful thing. Like, I was going to use a metaphor, but I don't want to open up that can of worms right when we're getting ready to wrap up here. Working out, exercise is something that our culture generally talks about as being beneficial. Statistically, evidence suggests that 180 minutes a week of elevated heart rate seems to be beneficial for people. So we encourage people to do that. Now, any given person that's doing it is going to be like, oh, well, this is not fun or pleasant or whatever. We say, well, override that, right? So we talk a lot about how it is sometimes important to override things, but then we talk a lot about why it's beneficial to exercise for X, Y, and Z reason. Not just a general sense of, oh, anything that is unpleasant, you should definitely do that a lot more. And there shouldn't be a general sense of anything that is pleasant, you should definitely do that a lot less. Look for the specific reasons. I wanted to talk more about games and video games and whatever, but I got to get going. It's good to be with you all. I will be back here same time next week, Monday. Oh, I missed a couple comments. Hello. Hey, and yo, what's up? Not much. And hey, good to see you. I will be back here next week, same time, Monday, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time. Happy to talk more about this or whatever else questions and thoughts and topics people bring. I appreciate you all being here, and especially those of you who are participating in the chat, and hope to see you again. Thanks. Bye.